Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you all enjoyed the screening of Coded Bias. If you want to join us in the chat and tell us where you're calling from, that would be great. But welcome to this very special event. My name is Dr. Jose Ramon Lizarraga. I'm also known as Dr. Thembot, also known as Agent Disruptor. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the streaming anniversary of Coded Bias. It's been a year since the documentary premiered on Netflix. Woo-hoo! Can we get some hype in the chat saying, congratulating us for this 1 year anniversary? Yes. I hope you all enjoyed our watch party because we are now in for a very special treat. I'm thrilled to welcome you all to this very special conversation with cast members of Coded Bias. Dr. Joy Bulenwini, Dr. Kathy O'Neill, and Professor Meredith Broussard. Y'all, I'm trying really hard not to fangirl right now. I've had about 20 minutes to decompress, but I don't know about y'all in the audience. This is an amazing treat to have these three brilliant people here. Today's event will go as follows. I will begin by briefly introducing our superstar cast. I will then pose a couple of pre-prepared questions that I have that are kind of broad general questions for them to answer. But then I want to bring in some questions from you, our wonderful audience. If you have any question, please use the chat, but you can also use it, go to our Twitter and pose any questions in tweets there as well. And if you didn't get to watch or finish the film before you came to today's talk, know that the film will be available at the link that we sent you earlier, and it will be available through the weekend. We are also live streaming today on Twitter, AJL United, at AJL United, and on our YouTube channel using the Algorithmic Justice League channel. So just search for at AJL United across these platforms. And as you're tweeting or as you're engaging in social media, please use the hashtag Coded Bias to tweet additional commentary. And of course, you can use the comments here across our platforms, and we get to see all of your wonderful comments or any questions that you might be coming up with. As a way to just introduce ourselves more broadly, as the Algorithmic Justice League, I want to just put out what our mission is. Jane, are you there? Yes. So AJL's mission is to raise public awareness about the impacts of AI, to equip advocates with empirical research, to bolster campaigns, build the voice and choice of the most impacted communities, and to galvanize researchers, policymakers, and industry practitioners to mitigate AI bias and harms. So that's what we're all about. So I want to start, of course, right now by introducing our superstar cast. First, we have Dr. Joy Bulenwini. Dr. Bulenwini, a poet of code, is a computer scientist who uses art and research to illuminate the social implications of artificial intelligence. She founded the Algorithmic Justice League, AJL, to create a world with more equitable and accountable technology. And there she is showing off her regalia, Dr. Joy. You're walking in a couple of days, I think, right?
Yes, next week sometime. I gotta look at details after this event.
Yeah, Dr. Joy. Next we have Dr. Kathy O'Neill. Kathy O'Neill earned a PhD in math from Harvard and worked as a math professor at Barnard College before switching over to the private sector, where she worked as a quant for the hedge fund D.E. Shaw and as a data scientist in the New York startup scene. She is a regular contributor to Bloomberg Opinion, and in 2016 wrote the book Weapons of Math Destruction, one of my favorite books, How Big Data Increases Inequality and Threatens Democracy. She is the CEO of Orca, an algorithmic auditing company. She's also a member of the Public Interest Tech Lab at the Harvard Kennedy School. And her new book that just came out called, sorry, I'm getting the title here, The Shame Machine: Who Profits from the New Age of Humiliation came out in March of 2022. Welcome, Dr. O'Neill. And
It's such
last
a
but
pleasure to be
go
here.
ahead.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, of course, so happy. Um, and last and certainly not least, we have Professor Meredith Broussard. Uh, Professor Meredith Broussard is a data journalist, also an assistant professor at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute of New York University. She is the author of Artificial Unintelligence: How Computers Misunderstand the World. She's an affiliate faculty of the Moore Sloan Data Science Environment at the NYU Center for Data Science. She's also a 2019 Reynolds Journalism Institute Fellow, and she has also worked as a software developer at AT&T Bell Labs and the MIT Media Lab. Welcome, Professor Broussard.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is so exciting. I'm trying to contain my fangirl tendencies, and I want to perhaps open with a kind of a general question, a broad question to start us off today. Given that so many of us just watched or rewatched Coded Bias together, I was wondering what you think Coded Bias has had as an impact. What influence have you seen this documentary have on public discourse or in your own professional spheres? What are some of those influences that you have seen? And we can start with any of you.
Got it. Well, I'll go ahead and go. For me, I remember when I was talking about this in 2016, meeting, Kathy was really the first. I was like, okay, I'm not in this by myself. There's a whole published book and somebody's on book tour. But I will say, when I would mention AI bias, algorithmic bias, that kind of thing, I used to get a lot of blank looks. Now I'll go to places and they're like, of course it's biased. Oh yeah, I know about facial recognition tech, and so I've seen this shift within public understanding just within everyday life. And so it feels like I don't have to start at that point of trying to say there's a problem. And I do think films like Coded Bias have contributed to that.
I'll jump in. I will say that as a algorithmic auditor, I talk to potential clients at least a couple times a week, especially with the new New York City law about auditing hiring algorithms, which is pretty amazing. And the way I sort of warm up the client in the pitch call is I talk about things that can go wrong with algorithms, and because of coded bias, and of course Joy's work with the gender shade study, and it's completely universally understood and known that this is a great example. So it's just like an archetypical example of what can go wrong, that I can always rely on for complete, the audience will understand what I'm saying. They will be there with me and they'll be able to generalize into other situations. So that's really super helpful as a touch point.
Yeah, I really think that coded bias has helped to shift the conversation, shift the cultural conversation around algorithmic accountability. It's helped people understand, as Kathy and Joy have said, understand the stakes of what's happening inside algorithmic systems. And I think that what's so important about gender shades, about coded bias, about weapons of mass destruction is that these artifacts help people to understand in a very practical way what is going on, what are the consequences, and how people are being harmed by these technologies. And I am really glad we're having these cultural conversations. I wish we didn't have to, but it's a big problem, and the only way we're going to solve the problem is by confronting it head on and talking about these issues.
Yes, wonderful. I must agree that coded bias on the other end, as someone who before I joined AJL was able to experience the impact of coded bias, at least on a personal uh, um, in a personal way, and how it has influenced my own thinking. My follow-up question, I guess, is based on what you all had just mentioned in terms of how you've seen the public shift in understanding of algorithms and algorithmic justice. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about that algorithmic audits and perhaps some of the collaborative work that you've done around the development of those algorithmic audits, or any other type of projects that have emerged since since Coded Bias came out.
Yes, well, one that we all got a chance to collaborate on was actually an algorithmic audit for the company Olay. And so we got together and there was a Decode the Bias campaign. They wanted to take advantage of my West African roots and also the effectiveness of their products. And we did the Decode the Bias campaign. But instead of only having the component that was seen externally, which was the commercial and the print ads and so forth, they also said, let's try to decode our own bias. And so they invited us in to actually check their Skin Advisor app that they have to recommend products. And so that was an opportunity for the three of us to collaborate together on an algorithmic audit. And I'm not sure if either of you want to speak a little bit more to it.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I had the chance to work with AJL and with Orca on auditing Olay's Skin Advisor. It was fun for me because I have a little bit of a background in fashion and skincare, which is not something that a lot of algorithmic auditors have. So it was fun to be able to draw on that. And one of the things that Kathy does really beautifully is she helps people confront the big scary issues. And she just says, all right, listen, we're going to look at this thing and we're going to talk about it. And we're going to confront it, even though it's really hard. And that's something I really admire.
It was actually a total pleasure to work with both you guys on the Olay Skin Advisor. And even though it's like relatively small stakes, to be honest, it's like, what kind of makeup should I wear, and where are my, issues.
Are you kidding? Makeup is incredibly high stakes.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, but it's not at the level of like who's going to prison, right? Like, let's
Fair.
But what it did so beautifully, and I really appreciate Joy's input into this, is it allowed us to elevate the conversation. Like, it's just an app for skin advisor, like for makeup stuff, or for skincare, but it was like elevated to like, wait, should we be thinking about skin tone in this way? And I basically feel like every time Joy enters a conversation, she elevates it. But 100%. It was a particularly beautiful moment for me to be like, well, I'm auditing this thing, but the actual advice we're giving to Olay is really profound. And so I really appreciated that experience.
Absolutely. And to that point, right, when we're starting to look at some of the advice we were giving them, we also saw that there was a link to potentially supporting diagnoses of skin cancer.
Yeah, that was something that was...
And melanoma, because you have this rich source. Oh, please go ahead.
Oh, so that was something that I learned a lot about during this process, was the diagnosis of melanoma, of skin cancer, on different skin colors, right? So I had never thought about skin cancer diagnosis before. And while I was on the road for talking about artificial unintelligence, I was talking to some nurses one day, and the nurses said, "Oh, well, we were thinking about what you said, and we have this problem where all of the medical textbooks show images of skin cancer on light skin. And then, so when we have a patient who doesn't have light skin, it's hard to figure out what skin cancer looks like." And so that was a really interesting, it was like a light bulb moment for me. And I connected it with Joy's work about skin tones and the way that automated systems are not recognizing certain skin tones. And I started thinking about, okay, what are the diagnostic consequences around this? So that was a really interesting moment for me.
Absolutely. And as I was learning more about that, I learned of this term medical apartheid. And there's a company called Melologic, and I believe the founder was actually inspired to start it because his wife, who's a darker skinned woman, passed from skin cancer, where it tends to be those with darker skin. If they are diagnosed, they're diagnosed in much later stages, going back to a bit of what Meredith was talking about, right? How people are even trained to recognize this. And so there are other types of collabs we might be able to do within that vein. And it started from this first one that we explored. The other thing that I thought was really brave of Olay with this algorithmic audit was we were able to publish the results. And that doesn't always happen, right? Or the results have to be very sanitized. And I had the final say over what would be published. And they were very forthright about the limitations. They also did something else that you don't always see with algorithmic audits, which is they made public commitments to make changes. And one of them was agreeing to a consented data promise. And part of why I wanted to work with Olay within the P&G family, given their reach, was if a company like P&G agrees to a consented data promise, right, it lifts what is expected and possible for consumer AI technology. So I would say, for me, I saw this like the way I saw gender classification. It's an entry point into a conversation. Right. And so I remember when I was doing gender shades, people were like, yeah, why do you want to look at gender? Right. But there's a way you can position the story that opens it up. And so when I saw Olay wanted to explore this, I was like, this is huge.
Yes, such opportunities for broader public pedagogy around these ideas that are are intersecting. I guess I want to pose a question from Twitter, which is related to this idea of education and learning and what this work can do to inform that. Twitter user at Scott H Moss asks, what do you see as the role of K-12 education in helping empower students to live in our AI dominated world?
Can I spin that to you, given your background and the kind of work you do? I feel this is a great question for one of our newest members of the Algorithmic Justice League, who's also a doctor doing all this
I was not expecting to pose a question that was going to be thrown back.
This one is your question. It's your domain.
I think I want to dovetail and maybe piggyback on the conversation that's already happening, right? In terms of how this collaboration around the AI audit was a necessarily interdisciplinary type of endeavor, right? Where there was creativity led a lot of the collaboration, but also our respective expertise in how we want the world to be a better place. And so K-12 plays an important role in my view, but I also want to hear what you all think, because it really is a decoupling, or maybe a problematizing that of where learning happens, and that it's not necessarily only happens in the classroom, and that it happens outside of the classroom. So, and that it's necessarily something that is interdisciplinary and not something that just happens in our own disciplinary silos. I don't
I'll
know.
just
What do you all think about that? Go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, I mean, I'm gonna first say what I'm not gonna say,
Okay.
because so many people I've heard when asked questions like this will talk about this notion of like literacy and how important it
Mhm.
is for young people to code. And don't get me wrong, I want young people to have skills in all sorts of ways. And obviously, there's a disparity in like who gets to code and et cetera, et cetera. But actually, with the reason I wrote Weapons of Math Destruction is because I wanted to make it clear that most of the sort of technical aspects of algorithms are like smoke screens
Right.
for what's underlying it, which is this notion of fairness and how we are being told to trust the algorithm implicitly, um, when we shouldn't be trusting it, because it doesn't really take that much technical knowledge to understand that it is codifying the past and propagating it into the future the way it's being used typically. So that's a long way of saying the following. I want to teach kids critical thinking skills,
Hmm.
not technical skills.
Right.
I think critical thinking skills are actually, and everybody wants that, but like it's not actually typically what we get with K through 12 education, right? We get is like drills and
Mhm.
memorization and like make sure you do well on this standardized test type thing. What I want to know is can kids think for themselves and say, wait, I don't believe that. I'm skeptical of that. Give me evidence that that's true. Um, and even just a thought experiment type of evidence. So that's my feeling is like if we could get kids to sort of say, I need to you can't just tell me it's math and I can't understand it. You need to say what is actually happening here and give them the kind of empowerment to ask critical questions.
Um, I I usually, when people ask me about K through 12 education and what can we do, I usually say, you can read my book, because
Yes, it's
I had
beautiful.
it vetted by some 10-year-olds and
Mhm.
they got it. Like they got it right away. Kids are really good at understanding algorithmic bias issues because they understand what's fair, right? And so if you break it down and you empower them to understand, as Kathy said, to use their critical thinking skills to understand, okay, this is just a machine. Like the machine works in one kind of way, it doesn't work in another kind of way. It's made by people, and people have to make decisions when they write code. You know, algorithms are opinions embedded in code. Isn't that the line from Weapons of Math Destruction? Right. So, I if you kind of explain to kids what's going on, you show them coded bias, you show them Joy's TED talk, like they get it right away and they're able to understand and they're able to apply that critical thinking to other situations. And kids are actually subjected to uh, all kinds of algorithmic decisions, and they're pretty resentful of it. Is what I've discovered in the classroom, and so I think these conversations are going on, but they need to go on at uh, like in much greater quantity.
Mhm.
And I'll add one thing here to this question is just remember my computer science teacher in 10th grade, Jill Connell, who saw that I liked to code and would let me come to her classroom during lunch and mess with Lego robots. And she would encourage me to enter competitions. And when what she was supposed to teach wasn't like I had finished that, right, she would go out of her way to give me more. I remember calculus teacher, Miss Sandoval, and I just remember all of these educators on my path who they didn't know what I was going to end up doing, but they never made me feel limited or like this wasn't something I can't do. And I remember in the film where Kathy's talking about the math teacher, like, why do you need to be in this class? You're a girl, you know? And so I think there's a lot that can happen in K through 12 in terms of affirming people and providing support when people don't get things wrong, where it's not something is fundamentally wrong with you, but okay, we're solving problems. Let's try different approaches. So I think that's another aspect of what could happen in K through 12 and beyond, actually. Like
and beyond, yeah, the playfulness that somehow we think doesn't happen in adulthood and still should happen in adulthood. Well, speaking of role models, we have a very special question from young Aurora, who has pre-recorded a question for all of you. And we are queuing up that video right now so she can ask.
I think the Algorithmic Justice League is doing good things. I want to help. What can kids in the US do to help fight biased technology? What can I do to help protect myself from biased technology?
That was amazing. Aurora is a hero.
Absolutely. Aurora reached out, her mom reached out like last Friday, and apparently they had done a class project. She's 7 years old in the first grade, and they chose an influential figure. And so she had her white glasses, a white mask, and a red blazer on, and shared her speech that she had done in first person, talking about the work of the Algorithmic Justice League. And so we're so glad, Aurora, that you had a chance to join us and ask your question. It's a great question in terms of what kids can do to support the fight for algorithmic justice. One thing I think is really important is helping other people become more aware. That's part of what the film Coded Bias does. It shows the importance of storytelling, and it also shows the importance that your voice matters, your opinions matter, your experiences matter. And I had a lot of people telling me that it didn't, you know, and I had to kind of push to say, no, what I'm pointing out makes a difference. And so I do think one thing I would encourage younger folks in the fight for algorithmic justice, right, is to speak up when you have questions. And then also the other thing that I think is tell your friends if you want to host a Coded Bias party, Agent Disruptor can help you out. I'm adding tasks, you know, and all of these things. And also help educate your parents. I know I educate my parents on things all the time as well. I wasn't sure if Kathy, you wanted to jump in the film. It shows you teaching your son some math.
Yeah, that's true. And obviously I really think empowering young people to ask good questions and to to never think that their questions are too simplistic or, you know, like there is no dumb question. I really believe that. As a mathematician, I feel like we're allowed to ask dumb questions, and that's kind of a superpower that we have. I feel like a lot of fields you're supposed to always appear to know everything already. But I think it's actually an advantage to just sort of say, I don't understand. Like, why do we think this works so well? Why do we think this is fair? Like, what are the patterns that this is picking up, if this is pattern matching? And you know, it started there for me. I will say that, like, even though I was being paid to build algorithms, I still was asking questions that they were it was almost like they were so basic that nobody else was going to ask them. And that's where my entire like study of this entire field started, which I was like, wait a second, isn't it true that we're just figuring out how much money someone has, and then we're giving people with money more opportunities than people without money? Like, it was like such a basic question that people were like, that sounds really bad. And I'm like, yeah, it is really bad. Exactly my point. You know what I mean? So I would say, like, in a certain sense, children, young people are the perfect people to be thinking about this stuff, because they are asking those questions. They're unfiltered. I certainly, my son is now 13. He asks the best questions, and I always want to encourage those kinds of like true curiosity. I will say though that, like, one of the things that I keep coming up against in my work, and I'm sure that Mare and Joy, you agree, that this is a systemic problem, right? So it's hard for any individual, including children, to solve this problem. It to Joy's point, it is a great idea to be educated on this point, to be educated about the problem, and to spread understanding of what can go wrong with algorithms. But it's difficult to solve it single-handedly. It's a systemic problem that needs to be solved systemically. So that's one of the reasons I hesitate to sort of say, here's what you can do, because it's not an individual's problem to solve. It's our problem to solve as a society.
All right, I'm a little depressed thinking about that, because we do want to give kids something like, okay, you should recycle, and then like everybody feels better recycling. But like, yeah, you're right, it's a systemic thing. I would say that it's interesting that you said that being a mathematician gives you the superpower of asking questions, because that's exactly how I feel about being a journalist. Journalists are nosy. We want to know who was there and what it looked like and what it smelled like and why the thing happened. And being a journalist gives you a license to ask a million questions. So I've always been just infinitely curious about things, about the world, about why do people do the things that they do. And I'm also really curious about how things work. I like to tinker with things. And so being a journalist gives me the license to ask these kinds of questions. So it's literally my job to ask questions. And so I think that boundless curiosity, Aurora, is going to serve you well in trying to make a difference in terms of algorithmic justice.
I have to wholeheartedly agree, and having worked with kids for, oh my gosh, almost 20 years, I hate to admit it, I think one of the best literacies that we can teach a child is to always ask questions. And I think something that Dr. O'Neill alluded to, which is something that a lot of us in the learning sciences are trying to disrupt, is this learning as a solitary, individualistic thing, learning and transformation, but something that is about the collective and about the collective imagining of a new future. I'm going to take some of the questions from our chat here and maybe recalibrate them a little bit so that they can foster some conversation. One of the questions that Yashila Bordag in our chat posed is, she asked, or they asked rather, what lenses do you hope ML and AI folks will use in developing algorithms and systems? And I guess if I'm gonna kind of like think about the type of work that you all three do, what are some of the ideologies? What are some of the paradigms that should be informing this work, or these lenses as these folks develop algorithms and systems?
I'll go ahead and go, and I'll tell what informed my work, Gender Shades. That's part of the film, which was really being introduced to intersectionality from Kimberly Crenshaw. And so her work on anti-discrimination law, right, and showing the limitations of only looking at people in one identity and not thinking about the ways in which other identities come together to shape somebody's experience, I found had applications not just for law, but also for computer science, and particularly computer vision and specifically gender classification. So that's how I ended up with the research paper that was called Gender Shades. And it contributed to the field of computer science in a way that I see that now more people, not enough, but more people are approaching questions, thinking about more than a singular identity. And so that one continues to inform my work as it has informed many others. And we're also very privileged that Miss Kim serves on the board for the Algorithmic Justice League, but it was through that connection. And we first met at the 2020 Sundance premiere of Coded Bias.
Yeah, I would say that intersectionality is just one of the most important starting points for thinking about these issues. One of the things that I write about in Artificial Unintelligence, and then I'm also covering in my new book, is an idea I call technochauvinism. It's a kind of bias that says that technology or technological solutions are superior to others. Instead, what I would argue is that we need to use the right tool for the task. And sometimes the right tool for the task is a computer, and then other times it's something simple like a book in the hands of a child sitting in its parent's lap. And one is not inherently better than the other. I would also point people to, in addition to Kathy and Joy's work, I would point them to Safia Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression, where she calls for a Black feminist tech criticism, and also Ruha Benjamin's book, Race After Technology. And Ruha Benjamin has this really interesting frame, which is the idea that automated systems discriminate by default. And so once you adopt that viewpoint, it becomes very powerful in terms of being able to see where the flaws are in an automated system.
Yeah, I'll try to respond as well. You know, both my parents were computer scientists, and I'm a mathematician. So I was raised in this kind of with this notion that this was non-political, that the work of coding was like almost pure thought, and it had sort of like nothing to do with the messiness of human existence. And I think, I mean, it felt wrong to me as a child. It was definitely wrong by the time I worked in finance, and it was outrageous by the time I was a data scientist. And yet, I feel like that is a kind of ethos or ideology that persists. And I think the reason it persists is because it's flattering to the people who do it. It's kind of the feeling I had as a working data scientist was like, oh, it's amazing how well this works. And what we forgot to say at the end of that sentence is like, it's amazing how well this works for people like us. So there's this kind of like blind spot, that, if you will, that people who work in this field have about who is actually harmed by these systems that are remarkable. They are remarkable, and they do certain things quite efficiently. But for whom do they fail? And that is sort of the leading question that, as a result, that I work with in every algorithmic audit, at every meeting. We ask that question: for whom does this fail? What I like about that question is that it immediately forces you to realize that there are a lot of stakeholders. Mm-hmm. And as soon as you start listing the stakeholders, you realize there are a lot of ways that this could fail for those folks. And this has nothing to do with pure mathematics or pure thought. It's everything to do with who gets privileged and who gets ignored in a given situation with finite resources. So anyway, long story short, I mean, that's a lot there, but I just feel like the entire discipline of computer science is really not quite there yet. I'm not. There's individuals that are amazing, and I'll finish with like the fact that what's sad about this from a problem solving perspective, because I am a mathematician and nerd at heart, is that like actually the hardest problems are yet to come. When we think through what it will look like to optimize to profit, right, or optimize to accuracy or optimize to efficiency, which are the things that we are trained to optimize to, with the constraint, with many constraints of making sure it doesn't fail for this group, making sure it doesn't pass this threshold for that group, that's actually much harder and much more of a challenge to our intellect. So it's like it's actually we're missing the boat by thinking we don't have to worry about these things, because we're actually not only harming people, but we're actually skipping over the interesting work.
You know, I'm thinking about empathy and how empathy is useful in anticipating problems inside algorithmic systems. So, like when you watch Coded Bias, when you look at gender shades, if you are a person with lighter skin and you say, oh, you know, people with darker skin are having this problem, like, and if you hadn't thought about that before, it allows you to think, okay, well, this is a problem that is experienced by people who are different than me in this particular way. And it lets you, it kind of gives you an avenue for empathy, for imagining other ways that technology might fail for somebody who is different than you. So I mentioned that I'm working on a new book. It's called More Than a Glitch, Understanding Race, Gender, and Ability Bias in Tech. And so to research that book, I had to think a lot about, okay, how is technology failing for people who are different than me in X kinds of ways? And it required talking to a lot of people and just a lot of empathy. So Joy, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about evocative audits, because I feel like that idea of empathy is what's going on inside or kind of in the core of the evocative audit.
Absolutely. I was trying to see if I had a copy of it. So evocative audits is what my PhD is about. So I got all this regalia hanging around, right? And so to this question of what can the individual do, because we are talking about issues that require collective action, what I found with evocative audits is the single example, the coding in the white mask, or in something like AI anti-woman, when I ask, can machines ever see, you know, our queens as we view them? Can machines ever see our grandmothers as we knew them? That's individual and personal. And I found that when I published Gender Shades, it showed a lot of performance metrics, but people started paying attention when I moved to the performance arts. And I realized that's where it began, even with the white mask example, right? And so what does it mean for me? All excited, you know, to finally go to MIT Media Lab, and now I'm coding in white face, right? What future do I have in this industry? You know, for me, it was like, clearly tech needs us. That was my takeaway, but there are other ways to understand that. And so with evocative audits, the idea is actually to focus on singular experiences as a way of increasing that empathy. And we also think through this notion of counter demo things. The counter demo, like counter stories or counter protests, is showing you the fail reel, and not saying because it fails, we must now optimize it, because you could be optimizing technology that's weaponized against you. It's saying we're showing it fail, so we question the entire system. we question with gender shades even, how do we evaluate how effective computer vision systems are? All of these machine learning techniques that are similar to this one use case. And so I have learned in my practice with evocative audits that the singular experience can be very powerful. And I go back to poetry, where one line of poem can encapsulate so much. I mean, we're sadly, not even a week from the massacre in Buffalo. And I think I read Amanda Gorman wrote something like, living is a dying art. Nowadays, living is a dying art. And in so few words, right, you can capture something that's both personal, but it's because of its humanity, many people can relate to that. And so that has been what I've learned with that practice of evocative audit, where the white mask, the evocative, leads to gender shades, the algorithmic audit. And then I'm like, wait, look at all these women of color. Let me actually put some women that I really admire. Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, right? Data science pioneer, hanging facts, stacking stats on the lynching of humanity, teaching truth hidden in data, each entry and omission. A person worthy of respect, right? We're coming back to the individual. We're imagining what it looks like. And we're also, with the evocative audit, allowing people to bear witness to the harm in some way. So I really appreciate you setting up the alley-oop for me, Meredith, on that one. But that's where the power of the individual comes in.
I think we were all resonating on that as Professor Broussard was finishing up her. I'm like, that's the evocative audit. So I'm glad that you were able to set that up. I have a question that from the audience as well that is somewhat that was answered to some degree already in our discussion today, but maybe we can have some explicitness around it. And this question is from Marcia Tudor, who states, what would you like to see lay people, non-CS background people, and activists do right now towards greater AI equity? What are the types of things that they can do?
Yeah, I think when it comes to public pressure, you don't need a CS degree. I like to say, if you have a face, you have a place in the conversation about different AI systems. And so there are various sorts of campaigns that are going on. In Massachusetts, we had the Press Pause campaign for a while. With the Algorithmic Justice League, we've been campaigning against ID Me, identity verification company that was adopted by the IRS. And so here, I mean, not everyone pays their taxes, but if you're meant to be paying taxes, right, this is an example of a broad-based area where you can start seeing where the use of biometrics like facial recognition can then put you in with surveillance, but you can actually push back. So we launched Dump ID .me in collaboration with Fight for the Future, ACLU, and many others. And we were successful in actually pushing the IRS to say they're going to drop ID Me, but they had some relationship struggles. So if you watch the Dr. Joy show parody, you'll see that we're encouraging them to truly dump ID .me. But since they've made that commitment, we're also looking at the 20 states and other federal agencies, including Veteran Affairs, Social Security Administration, that are still involved with ID Me. So that's one way you can get connected right now. If you can put in your name on that petition. We were successful with the IRS push, and now we're pushing for more. So I would say that's an immediate thing you can do. Dump ID .me. Share the Dr. Joy show parody as well, so people know why we're trying to dump them. So that's one thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'll suggest that most, if not nearly all, of the algorithmic harm that happens has nothing to do with technical knowledge. It has to do with grappling with stakeholders and harm and asking for evidence that the harm isn't happening. And, I guess at a higher level, what I suggest is placing the burden of like proof on the people who deploy algorithms rather than the people who are harmed by them. So my analogy is that we have the FDA, which is not a perfect agency, but what the FDA requires of drug companies before they sell a drug is that they prove that it's both safe and effective. Imagine if they didn't ask for that, right? It meant that that would mean that like they are making drugs that kill people or that don't work as well as the old medicine or that kill certain types of people, or never mind simply don't work. That's of course already bad, but I'm saying worse than that. I feel like that's kind of where we are with algorithms. Algorithms are deployed and there is no proof that they work as well as the system that they're replacing. There's no proof that they don't cause extra harm on specific types of people. And the burden of proving harm isn't the people who own and profit from the algorithm, it's the people that are harmed by the algorithm. So that, again, going back to the medicine example, that would be like, your medicine harmed me. And it's like really hard to prove that if you're an individual, but that's why the FDA says, no, you have to do a randomized controlled trial, because that's how you do statistics, right? You like literally any individual who died after taking a medicine, they might have just died because of other things. But if you have a randomized controlled trial, you can say, statistically speaking. So in other words, it's a statistical question that individuals simply can't do. So let me go back to the actual question. So sorry, I'm in a little tangent here, but my point is that like I think everyone just understood what I said. This is not, it doesn't require machine learning. It doesn't require an advanced degree. It requires the notion of evidence, statistical evidence, that what's happening here isn't harming people. And that is a conversation that everyone can have and everyone can join. And it just requires, again, going back to my original question of the original point about K through 12 education, it requires critical thinking, which I think after watching Coded Bias and hearing Dr. Bulenwini speak, everyone will have that sort of the correct posture when confronted with an algorithm. Of course, that still leaves the question of when are you being confronted with algorithm? And the problem is that we don't have laws yet in effect that would even inform you that you're being scored by an algorithm and that your opportunities are being curtailed by algorithmic decisions. So that's another sort of political problem. But if we do know that an algorithm's in effect, we need to take that posture that I just want to insist once again does not require that technical skills. It just requires this notion of like, show me the evidence.
Absolutely. I'm gonna take a little panelist privilege here because one of my best friends, Dr. Nasima Muhammad, we went to Oxford University together, and without her, I wouldn't be here. And so she posed the question, what do you think is the greatest danger to AI justice? If you could remove one obstacle, what would it be? And I think we can go back to the film on this one. And one of the things that I've seen and I heard so many times in this fight with facial recognition technologies and surveillance, biometric surveillance, was there's nothing we can do, the sense of complacency. And I was so encouraged in 2022, right, when we saw IBM step away from selling facial recognition to law enforcement. We saw Microsoft step back saying we're not going to sell it unless or until there's regulation. Amazon paused for a year, halted. And yes, from a cynical side, you can say it served the business interests to do so. We also had Facebook delete billions of face prints, right? There was a face purge and they had legal liabilities to consider, right? With the $550 million lawsuits. I bring up these examples, or the 14 cities that have restrictions on facial recognition technology, resistance does work. And when we get the narrative that, oh, it's not going to happen, etc., people stop pushing and people stop trying. So I think it's really important that we celebrate the victories while acknowledging the obstacles that are still ahead. And also, as we are celebrating, right, don't lose sight that the opposition is regrouping. You know, those who want these technologies to propagate are thinking of other ways that they can use them. And sometimes they can have good arguments for what some of the benefits might be. But if they're not attending to the harms as well, that's not good enough. And so I think the greatest danger is our own complacency, and a way around that is to lift up and celebrate the wins. The Brooklyn tenants, right? We see at the end of the film, they were able to successfully resist the installation of the recognition system in their building. And also, as Icy May said, but there's nothing that stops the landlord from adding it back. And that's where that collective action component comes in. That's why we have organizations like the Algorithmic Justice League, right? We keep holding the feet to the fire. We turn up the heat a little bit. You know, you said you were going to do this, did you? So that's a great question, Dr. Muhammad.
Can we have that question be posed to the other two panelists? That's our final question as well. What is that one obstacle that we could remove towards algorithmic justice?
Well, I think we need to start with technochauvinism. I think we need to start with questioning the idea that computers are neutral, that computational solutions are objective, are unbiased. As Kathy said before, there's this perception inside computer science that doing something with a computer gets you away from the messy realities of being human. And it's simply not true. Like, there is no way of delivering ourselves from the messy reality of being human. We need to kind of embrace the messiness and understand that that it's not always going to be a straight line, and that mathematical equality is not the same as justice. And we need to stop pretending that there is going to be some kind of mathematical solution to social justice.
Sometimes I get asked, like what causes a terrible algorithm to sort of take place, you know, almost like it's a natural disaster. And I have an answer to that, which is it's fundamentally unsatisfying, but I still think it's useful, which is that an algorithm becomes a weapon of math destruction, if you will. It becomes a terrible, destructive algorithm when it's replacing a conversation we don't want to have. And so I think the answer to the question for me is that we actually have to have those hard conversations. We can't, and it's exactly, I'm just reframing what Mara just said about technochauvinism. Technochauvinism is the assumption that an algorithm can solve our problems better than we can. It's never going to be true. We're not going to understand what prisons really are for until we have the conversation. It's not, you know, slapping an algorithm on top of a crime risk algorithm on top of sentencing as a system doesn't actually clarify anything, because we never had the fundamental conversation about what a successful prison stay looks like. And until we define success carefully, we can't optimize to success. So I would just say that those conversations that we're trying to avoid as a culture, and we're trying to hide behind the algorithms, those are the conversations we have to have. That would be the most fundamental thing we could do to improve our system.
Thank you so much. And I apologize to our audience if we didn't get to your question, but please keep in touch at ajl.org, and you can find some resources there as well. But I do want to end today by echoing what Dr. Bulenwini said earlier in terms of recognizing that we do live in perilous times, and that we want at AJL to recognize and pay honor to the lives that were lost last weekend in Buffalo, New York, and as well as in Southern California. We want to end with a beautiful poem in honor of the people who we love and honor the most in our lives, by Dr. Bulenwini, um, to the Ex-Coded.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming to this celebration. It's very meaningful that is happening the day before I officially graduate from MIT. And in the film, you see me share part of this poem with some of the Brooklyn tenants. And I expanded that poem to say, to the Ex-Coded, anyone who might be harmed by AI systems, which means no one is immune from being Ex-Coded. To the Ex-Coded, resisting and revealing the lie that we must accept the surrender of our faces, the harvesting of our data, the plunder of our traces. We celebrate your courage. No silence, no consent. You show the path to algorithmic justice requires a league, a sisterhood, a neighborhood, hallway gatherings, Sharpies and posters, research and potlucks, dancing and music, watch parties and cast conversations, restreams, Twitter, hashtags, all that good jazz. Everyone playing a role to orchestrate change. To the Ex-Coded and freedom fighters around the world and in the chats, persisting and prevailing against algorithms of oppression, automating inequality through weapons of math destruction, getting glitchy in these systems, causing shame we should overcome. We stand with you in gratitude. You demonstrate the people have a voice and a choice. When defiant melodies harmonize to elevate human life, dignity, and rights, the victory is ours. Thank you.
Thank you all again for joining us. Dr. Joy Bulenwini, Dr. Kathy O'Neill, Professor Meredith Broussard. This is inspiring and wonderful. And I feel humbled, excited. I don't know if you noticed how nervous I was to have been part of this conversation and to be part of this, but be officially welcomed into this family. A special thanks to Adele and to Jane, who are managing all of our production in the back end. You're not seen on the screen, but you certainly are felt and deeply appreciated. Remember that the celebration is not over. We do have Drag and the Coded Bias happening tomorrow, and we're going to be dragging it. Oh, you can't see my fan. Yes, a little bit.
I like that.
We're going to have Little Miss Hot Mess and Persia joining us for a wonderful conversation around dragging algorithmic bias. But thank you all for joining us again. This was wonderful, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening.